The Tuesday lunch rush at Ray's Diner was a predictable symphony of mediocrity. The clatter of cheap, heavy cutlery against thick ceramic plates, the sizzle of burgers on a griddle that hadn't been truly cleaned since the Reagan administration, the low, rumbling drone of conversations about mortgage rates, office politics, and weekend golf scores. The air itself was a character, thick and layered with the ghosts of a million meals, the sharp tang of stale coffee, the sweet, greasy perfume of frying onions, and the faint, almost imperceptible scent of desperation that clung to the cracked red vinyl of the booths. Ray's was a purgatory of formica and fluorescent lighting, a place people didn't choose so much as end up in. For Kesha Johnson, it was the front line. At 34, her life had been a series of front lines, each more demanding than the last. This one, at least, didn't involve incoming fire. Not literal fire, anyway. "Look, Freddy Krueger came to work today." The voice, loud and braying, belonged to Davidson. He slammed a fleshy hand on the table, making the salt and pepper shakers jump. His three companions, a hyena pack in ill-fitting suits, erupted in sycophantic laughter. They were the highlight of Kesha's Tuesday, a weekly ritual of cruelty that they seemed to regard as a corporate team-building exercise. Davidson was some kind of mid-level executive at a consulting firm, a man whose sense of self-worth was directly proportional to the amount of misery he could inflict on those he deemed beneath him. "Hey monster, bring more coffee over here," he shouted, snapping his fingers. "But be careful not to spill it with those burnt hands." The laughter echoed through the diner, a harsh, ugly sound that made a few other customers shift uncomfortably in their seats. Most, however, just kept their eyes on their plates, practicing the urban art of determined indifference. All eyes, for a moment, turned to Kesha. She held the heavy glass coffee pot, her hands perfectly steady. The scars were the first thing anyone ever noticed about her, a latticework of raised, discolored skin that snaked from her fingertips up, her right arm disappearing under the starched white sleeve of her uniform. They were a roadmap of a past she never spoke of, a story written in pain. Kesha had learned to live with the stares, the whispers, the flinches of strangers. She had faced down things that would make men like Davidson weep into their overpriced lattes. Their juvenile insults were like pebbles thrown at a fortress. What they couldn't see, what their limited imaginations could never comprehend, was that every cruel word wasn't chipping away at her. It was fueling something deep inside, a quiet, cold resolve that grew stronger with every slight, a strength forged in a fire they could never understand. "I bet it was in a fire in the ghetto," whispered Brett, Davidson's obsequious accountant, just loud enough for the whole diner to hear. He was a small, weaselly man who seemed to draw sustenance from his boss's approval. Or maybe she was trying to cook crack and the whole thing blew up. Davidson roared, delighted with his own wit. "You know how it is in that community." "Could be her boyfriend did it to her," added the third man, Chad. "Domestic violence is a real problem for them." Kesha approached their table, her steps measured and even. Her posture was erect, her spine a rod of steel, a stark contrast to the slumping, defeated demeanor they were trying to force upon her. She moved with a controlled, economical grace, an efficiency of motion that was almost unnerving. When she reached their table, she poured the coffee, her scarred hand tilting the pot with the precision of a surgeon. The stream of dark liquid filled their cups without a single wasted drop, a silent rebuke to their clumsy, loud existence. "Anything else, gentlemen?" she asked. Her voice was calm, level, a placid lake on a windless day. The sheer, unruffled tranquility of it seemed to confuse Davidson more than any angry retort could have. He had been expecting tears, a stammer, a flash of anger, any reaction that would confirm his power over her. Her composure was a denial of that power, and it infuriated him. "Yeah, an explanation." Davidson leaned forward, his small piggish eyes gleaming with malice. "Tell us how you got those. Was it an accident? Or did someone finally have to teach you a lesson?" For a fraction of a second, something flickered in Kesha's dark eyes. It was a change in the light, a sudden, chilling depth. It wasn't fear. It wasn't shame. It was the look of a soldier on a high ridge, gazing down at a vast, empty landscape, remembering the thunder of a battle that had taken place there. It was the look of someone who had stared death in the face and had decided, with quiet authority, that it would have to wait its turn. But Davidson, a man entirely consumed by his own petty performance, was blind to it. "Work," Kesha replied simply, her voice flat. She turned to leave. "What kind of work leaves a person looking like that?" Brett insisted, his voice heavy with a theatrical, mocking contempt, nightclub bouncer, a prostitute who got on the wrong side of her pimp. Careful. Kesha didn't raise her voice. She didn't turn around completely. She just stopped, her backs mostly to them, and spoke that single word into the air. But the way she said it, the low resonant frequency of it, changed the atmospheric pressure at the table. It was not a plea. It was not a warning. It was a statement of fact, as simple and as dangerous as a landmine buried just beneath the sand. Some stories, she added, her voice still quiet, are more dangerous to tell than you can imagine. Davidson laughed again, but this time it was forced, brittle. Ooh, look. The monster's trying to be scary. What are you gonna do, huh? Burn us. With your Freddy Krueger hands. What none of them knew, what none of them could ever know, was that as they spewed their venom, Kesha's mind was operating on a different level. It was a military mind, trained to observe, to analyze, to catalog. She memorized their faces, the names they called each other, the details of their lives they carelessly dropped in conversation. A wife's complaint about a trip to Cabo, a brag about closing a deal with a company called Omnicorp, a gripe about an upcoming audit. Every piece of data was being collected, processed, and filed away by a relentless internal machine, stored for a purpose they could not begin to fathom. Across the diner, hidden in a booth in the back corner, a man in his late 40s watched the scene unfold with a growing sense of unease. James Wright was just passing through a ghost on a cross-country trip, trying to outrun his own memories. He had stopped at Ray's for a quiet cup of coffee, a moment of peace on a long, lonely highway. But the verbal brutality he was witnessing was turning his stomach. He had seen bullies like this before, in boardrooms and on battlefields, men who confused cruelty with strength, but it was the waitress who held his attention. There was something about her, something in the rigid calm of her posture, the way she absorbed their insults without flinching, the unnerving stillness in her eyes. It was a composure that wasn't natural, it was forged. It was the serenity of someone who had been tested in fire and had not been consumed. It awakened a distant, deeply buried memory in James, a resonance he recognized from a life he had tried to leave behind. It was the look of a soldier. Kesha moved to a nearby table and began wiping it down with a damp cloth, her movements methodical. As she worked, she muttered something under her breath, so quietly that only someone with James's trained hearing could have caught it. It was a phrase that had become her private mantra, a line of code she ran to maintain her sanity in the face of the daily onslaught. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, she whispered to the empty booth, because you haven't seen anything this monster is capable of yet. It was a strange, nonsensical phrase, but in the context of the moment, it sounded like a promise. There, under the flickering, unforgiving lights of a cheap Texas diner, while enduring humiliations that would have shattered most people, Kesha Johnson held a secret, and James Wright, watching from the shadows, had the sudden, chilling feeling that the secret she held was a weapon, and that the arrogant men at the front table were unknowingly writing the terms of their own surrender. Davidson, however, was not a man to be deterred by subtlety. Kesha's implacable calm was a gauntlet thrown down, a challenge to his entire worldview. His need to break her, to see her crumble, became an obsession. Work, he repeated, his voice a mocking drawl that dripped with sarcasm. What kind of work, sweetheart? Because last I checked, you serve coffee and wipe up spills. Not exactly what I'd call a high-risk profession, unless you count the risk of dying of boredom. Brett, ever the loyal hyena, chimed in. Maybe she worked at a barbecue joint and fell into the pit. Or in a dry cleaner's, got splashed with some chemicals. You know, jobs for people like her. Kesha stopped wiping the table. She placed the rag down with slow, deliberate precision. When she turned to face them again, James Wright saw it. The others were blind to it, but he saw the subtle, almost imperceptible shift in her stance. Her weight redistributed, her feet slightly wider apart. It was a preparatory stance, a fighter settling in before the first bell. People like me, Kesha asked. Her voice maintained its unnerving calm, but there was a new layer to it, a resonant frequency that vibrated with something cold and hard. No, Davidson said, recovering his swagger. People who work with their hands. Manual labor. Nothing that requires too much brainpower. It was at that exact moment that James's heart seized. Kesha leaned forward slightly to pick up a napkin that Davidson had contemptuously thrown on the floor. As she did, the loose sleeve of her uniform shirt rode up a few inches on her right forearm. The scars were a brutal, chaotic map of violence, but just below her elbow, peeking out from under the white fabric, was something else. It was the faded, but unmistakable edge of a tattoo. James could only see a few partial letters, a fragment of an emblem. But to a man who had spent 15 years in the United States Army, the iconography was as clear and as instantly recognizable as the American flag. It was a unit patch. Manual labor, Kesha murmured, more to herself than to them, as she straightened up. That's an interesting way to describe carrying a wounded soldier 300 meters under sustained enemy fire. Davidson blinked, his brain, slow and sluggish, from too much cheap coffee and unearned confidence, struggling to process her words. What did you say? Nothing, Kesha replied, her tone shifting back to neutral, her expression once again an unreadable mask. Never mind. Do you want the bill, or are you gentlemen going to sit here all day making astute observations about my appearance? The abrupt dismissal, the sheer audacity of it, caught Davidson completely off guard. He was used to being the one who ended conversations, the one who decided when the game was over. He was not used to being dismissed, especially not by someone he considered to be, in the grand scheme of his important life, nothing more than a piece of furniture. His confusion quickly curdled into rage. Listen here, you little, he started, pushing his chair back and rising to his feet, his voice escalating in volume. You're going to show us the respect we deserve. We're paying customers, and you're just a what? Kesha interrupted. She turned to face him fully now. For the first time since they had arrived, she made direct, unwavering eye contact with Davidson, and the full, concentrated force of her presence seemed to hit him like a physical blow. He actually took an involuntary half-step back. James Wright watched, his breath held. He knew that look. He had seen it on the faces of drill sergeants, of battle-hardened squad leaders. It was the look of absolute, unshakable authority. She wasn't just defending her dignity anymore. She was establishing command of the battlefield. An employee, Davidson finished, his voice now lacking its earlier bravado. And employees should know their place. My place, Kesha repeated slowly, as if tasting the words, exploring their weight and meaning. You're right. I should know my place. She paused, letting the silence hang in the air for a beat. The problem is, you have absolutely no idea what my real place is. The tension in the diner was now a physical entity, a thick, crackling presence in the air. Other customers had stopped pretending to eat. Phones were now discreetly aimed at the unfolding drama. The restaurant manager, a perpetually worried man named Tony, emerged from the swinging doors of the kitchen, a dish towel in his hand. He took one look at the scene, at the stance Kesha had taken, and froze. He had known Kesha for 2 years. He had seen her absorb torrents of abuse with a quiet grace that he secretly, deeply admired. But he had never seen her like this. It was like watching a storm gather over a calm sea. You know what? Davidson continued, his pride forcing him to push forward, to escalate, even as his instincts screamed at him to retreat. I bet you didn't even finish high school. I bet those scars are from some Bacali street fight, people. Like you are always getting into trouble. And that was the final straw. James saw the change in her eyes, a subtle transformation, as if a switch had been flipped deep inside her. The quiet endurance was gone, replaced by something ancient and formidable. It was the look of a warrior who had decided that the time for reconnaissance was over, and the time for engagement had begun. Street fighting, Kesha murmured, and a small, humorless smile touched her lips. It was a smile that did not reach her eyes, and it was the most terrifying thing James had ever seen. It's funny how you always assume the worst, how your imagination is so limited. It never occurs to you that maybe, just maybe, these marks are not a record of shame, but a testament to something noble. Davidson let out a loud, braying laugh. Noble, look at you. You work in a roadside grease pit. What could possibly be noble about your life? Kesha began to walk slowly toward their table. Her steps were measured, deliberate, silent. Each footfall seemed to land with an impossible weight. When she stopped beside Davidson's chair, she leaned in, her personal space invading his, forcing him to crane his neck to look up at her. She lowered her voice to a whisper, a sound that was somehow more intimidating than any shout. The difference between you and me, Davidson, she said, her voice a low, cold hum, is that you judge people by the surface you can see. I judge them by what I know they are capable of doing when everything is on the fire, and no one is coming to save them. A genuine chill, cold and sharp, traced its way down Davidson's spine. There was a certainty in her voice, a granite-hard authority that his entire life of privilege had not prepared him for. All his self-preservation instincts were screaming at him now, but his pride, that fragile, bloated thing, was still in command. Are you threatening me? He asked, trying to infuse his voice with indignation, but it came out thin and reedy. Threatening you? Kesha straightened up, her professional mask sliding back into place. Of course not. I'm just pointing out a simple fact of life. Sometimes, people make the grave mistake of underestimating who they're dealing with, and by the time they realize their error in judgment, it's usually far, far too late to do anything about it. James Wright knew he could no longer stay silent. He had seen enough. During his 15 years of service, he had developed an almost sixth sense for identifying fellow veterans, even when they were trying their best to be invisible. It was in the small things, the way they stood, the way they scanned a room, the way their eyes never truly seemed at rest. And Kesha Johnson was a five-alarm fire of tells. As Davidson slumped back into his chair, trying to process the quiet, devastating counterattack he had just endured, James stood up. He walked to the counter, his own movements economical, his posture straight. He ordered another coffee, his eyes never leaving Kesha, as she passed by him. On her way to another table, he spoke, his voice low, and for her ears only. "Excuse me," he said. "Can I talk to you for a moment?" Kesha's assessment of him was instantaneous. A flicker of her eyes that took in his military-style haircut, his posture, the subtle but unmistakable confidence of a man who knew how to handle himself. Veteran, she noted to herself. Probably Army or Marines. Respectful, but direct. "Sure," she said aloud, "but make it quick. I still have tables to wait." "That tattoo," James whispered, nodding towards her right arm. "On your forearm, 1st Infantry Division. The big red one." Her body went rigid for a fraction of a second, the only outward sign that his words had hit their mark. "You served Marines," he confirmed. "2 tours in Afghanistan, and judging by those scars, you've seen a hell of a lot more action than I ever did." He glanced discreetly towards Davidson's table, where the executive was now loudly recounting his version of the confrontation to his cronies, casting himself as the hero. "These idiots," James said, his voice a low growl of contempt, "have absolutely no idea who they're messing with, do they?" For the first time, a genuine ghost of a smile touched Kesha's lips. "Not a clue," she confirmed. "Combat medic?" James asked, his eyes noting the incredible precision of her movements. The way she had instinctively checked her surroundings for threats. "Combat trauma specialist," she corrected him softly. 3 tours in Iraq. First in, last out. She looked James directly in the eye, a silent communication passing between them, a shared understanding that transcended words. "And you're right about them not knowing who they're messing with," she said. "But it's not time for them to find out. Not yet." The battle was far from over. It had only just begun. After the Tuesday lunch rush subsided, a fragile peace settled over Ray's diner. The hyena pack led by Davidson had departed, leaving behind a mess of dirty plates and a lingering stain of toxic masculinity in the air. The remaining customers ate in a subdued silence, the earlier confrontation having soured the taste of their burgers and fries. Kesha moved through the room, clearing tables with the same focused efficiency as before, but now there was a new energy emanating from her, a low hum of purpose that was almost visible. The mask of the weary waitress had slipped, and what lay beneath was something far more formidable. James Wright sat in his corner booth, nursing his coffee, watching her. He had cancelled his plans for the rest of the day. The cross-country trip, the ghosts he was running from, all of it could wait. He had stumbled upon something important here. In this purgatory of formica and fried food, he had found a fellow soldier fighting a different kind of war, on a different kind of battlefield, and he was not about to leave her flank exposed. When the last of the lunch customers had trickled out, leaving only James and the clatter from the kitchen, Kesha finally approached his table. She slid into the booth opposite him, her movements weary but still precise. She placed 2 clean mugs on the table and filled them from the pot she carried. "My shift ends in 20 minutes, she said, her voice low, "but I figure we can talk." Now Tony's hiding in the back, probably terrified Davidson is going to sue him for emotional distress. James managed a small smile. "He should be more worried about you suing Davidson." Kesha let out a short, humorless laugh. "A lawsuit is too messy, too public. It's not my style. My style is quieter, more strategic." She took a sip of her coffee, her eyes never leaving his. "So, Marines. What was your MOS?" "Intelligence," James replied. "Signal intelligence, mostly. Intercepting and analyzing enemy communications." Kesha nodded, a look of understanding passing between them. "The quiet war," she said. "I get it. I was a 68W healthcare specialist, but they called us combat trauma specialists in the field. Sounds fancier than the person who runs into the firefight to stuff your guts back in." She held up her right arm, the sleeve now pushed up to her elbow, revealing the full, brutal tapestry of her scars. This was from an IDE near Fallujah's second tour. She spoke of it with a chilling matter-of-factness, the way someone else might talk about a kitchen accident. James didn't press for details. He didn't need to. He knew that story. It was written on her skin, in the haunted depths of her eyes. He also knew that the story she told was only the surface. The real scars, the ones that didn't fade, were on the inside. "I was a ghost for a long time after I got back," James confessed, his own voice dropping. "Drifted for years. This trip, it was supposed to be me trying to find a reason to stop drifting." "Did you find one?" Kesha asked, her gaze direct, analytical. "I think I might have just stumbled into one," he replied, meeting her gaze. "The men, Kesha, they're not just bullies, they're predators, and they picked the wrong prey." A silent agreement passed between them, a pact forged in the shared language of service and sacrifice. The mission had been defined. That evening, Davidson, stewing in his own self-importance, decided to escalate. He couldn't let the waitress's defiance stand. He called Tony, the diner manager. His voice was a slick mixture of feigned concern and veiled threats. He spoke of unstable employees, customer safety, and the potential for negative online reviews. He hinted that a man of his standing in the community could make things very difficult for a small business like Ray's Diner. Tony, a man whose primary life skill was conflict avoidance, was terrified. He called Kesha at home, his voice trembling. "Kesha, that man, Davidson, he wants me to fire you. He's threatening to ruin me if I don't. Don't worry about it." Tony, Kesha's voice, came back over the line, calm and reassuring. "You don't have to do anything. I have this under control." "But how? What are you going to do?" "Just trust me," she said. "And if he calls again, tell him you're reviewing the situation. Buy me 48 hours. Meanwhile, James had set up a makeshift command center in his cheap motel room. He had unpacked his gear, a formidable array of encrypted laptops, satellite data links, and signal interception hardware. He was no longer a drifting ghost. He was back in his element. He was an intelligence operative with a target. Omnicorp Consulting, he murmured to himself, his fingers flying across a keyboard. "Let's see what skeletons you have in your closet, Mr. Davidson." He started with the breadcrumbs Kesha had given him from months of reconnaissance, the names of clients, the snippets of deals, the casual brags about corporate restructuring. Working with Kesha over a secure line, they began to piece together a puzzle. James, with his expertise in data analysis and digital forensics, followed the money. Kesha, with her incredible memory for conversations and her intuitive understanding of human behavior, provided the context. What they uncovered was a rot that went far deeper than a few racist jokes in a diner. Omnicorp's entire business model was predicated on a form of corporate ethnic cleansing. They specialized in helping companies streamline their workforce, which was a sanitized euphemism for finding legally defensible ways to fire older employees, women, and people of color. The methods were insidious. They would create retroactive performance reviews, document non-existent infractions, and build paper trails of cultural incompatibility to justify terminations that were, at their core, deeply discriminatory. James managed to access Omnicorp's internal servers, using a vulnerability in their outdated security protocols. What he found was a treasure trove of incriminating evidence. Emails from Davidson to his clients outlining the strategies, memos detailing how to manage out employees who were pregnant or had disabilities, financial records showing a pattern of bonuses paid to Davidson and his team for every problem employee they successfully eliminated. "He's not just a bigot," James said to Kesha over their encrypted link, his voice tight with disgust. "He's a predator who has monetized prejudice. He's built his entire career on the ruins of other people's lives." "I know," Kesha replied, her voice cold as ice. "I've been listening to him brag about it for a year. But listening is not enough. Now, we need to act." They formulated a plan of attack. It was a classic military strategy, a multi-pronged assault, designed to overwhelm the enemy's defenses and shatter his command and control structure. Phase 1 was psychological operations. James created an anonymous, untraceable blog and began to leak heavily redacted documents from the Omnicorp server. He didn't name names, not yet. He just posted excerpts from the memos, case studies of the discriminatory firings, stripping them of identifying details but leaving the ugly, undeniable methodology intact. The posts began to circulate in corporate ethics and human resources circles, creating a buzz of unease. Phase 2 was direct action. Kesha, with James's help, drafted a formal, meticulously detailed complaint. They sent one copy to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission (EEOC) and another to the Department of Labor. The complaint was a masterpiece of legal precision, cross-referencing dates, names, and specific conversations that Kesha had memorized, all backed by the anonymous but verifiable documents James had posted. Phase 3 was the flanking maneuver. James identified Omnicorp's 3 largest clients. He then created a series of anonymous information packets, tailored for each one, detailing exactly how Davidson had illegally targeted their former employees. The packets were sent not to the CEOs, but to the heads of their legal departments and to the most outspoken members of their boards of directors, the ones with a reputation for being ethical watchdogs. For a week, there was silence. Davidson, feeling he had successfully intimidated Tony, returned to the diner the following Tuesday, his swagger fully restored. He made a few pointed jokes about unemployed monsters, but Kesha served him with the same unnerving calm as always, giving no indication that the world was about to fall on his head. The first domino fell on a Friday afternoon. The CEO of Omnicorp's largest client, a publicly traded tech company, called an emergency board meeting. He had been presented with the anonymous information packet and was, to put it mildly, terrified. The potential for a massive class action lawsuit was a corporate nightmare. He called Davidson and, in a profanity-laced tirade, suspended their multi-million-dollar contract indefinitely. Davidson was stunned. He tried to do damage control, but he was fighting a ghost. He had no idea where the information was coming from. He blamed a disgruntled former employee, a corporate rival, anyone but the invisible woman who poured his coffee every week. The second domino fell the following Monday. The EEOC formally notified Omnicorp that they were opening a full-scale investigation into their business practices, citing a complaint of unprecedented detail and scope. Panic began to set in at Omnicorp's offices. Partners started lawyering up, turning on each other. The final, devastating blow came on the next Tuesday, exactly 1 week after Davidson's last visit to the diner. This time, Kesha was ready. As Davidson and his crew sat down, they noticed a new energy in the diner. Several tables were occupied by people who did not look like the usual lunch crowd. They were journalists, alerted by an anonymous tip. At a table in the corner sat 2 stone-faced investigators from the Department of Labor. Davidson, seeing them, began to sweat. Kesha approached his table, but this time she wasn't carrying a coffee pot. She was carrying a small, digital audio recorder. "Mr. Davidson," she said, her voice clear and carrying through the now silent diner. "I believe you're familiar with the concept of one-party consent for audio recordings, which is the law here. In Texas," she pressed play, and Davidson's own voice, loud and clear, filled the room, bragging about how he had helped a client fire a black employee by faking her performance reviews. The recording went on for 2 full minutes, a litany of his own vile, discriminatory tactics, all spoken in his own arrogant, self-satisfied voice. As the recording ended, James Wright, who had been sitting at the counter, stood up and handed a thick file to the journalists and another to the investigators. "I believe you'll find this contains the full, unredacted documentation corresponding to that recording, and several hundred others like it," he said. Davidson's face was the color of ash. He looked at Kesha, truly seeing her for the first time. He saw not a waitress, not a monster, but the architect of his complete and utter ruin. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was checkmated. Kesha looked down at him, her eyes not filled with hatred or triumph, but with a kind of weary sorrow. "You asked me where I got my scars," she said, her voice soft but echoing in the silence. "I got them trying to save men, who were better than you will ever be. You should have shown them some respect." The transformation was complete. The quiet, invisible waitress had revealed herself to be a master strategist, a warrior who had turned a year of quiet humiliation into the ammunition for a war that Davidson never even knew he was fighting. She had not just won, she had rewritten the rules of engagement.